The little girl cried in despair as she clung to the millionaire's uncle's grave, and the reason was Manchester's sky was shrouded in dense clouds that late August afternoon, the kind of damp cold that seeps into your bones and makes people huddle inside their coats, seeking a sliver of warmth that always seems distant. In the silence of St. Francis of Assisi Cemetery, among rows of centuries-old tombs and grey granite monuments that told the stories of past generations, a man of imposing stature remained kneeling before a simple headstone, discreet by his family's standards, a family accustomed to the excesses and displays of power that money afforded. Richard Montgomery, one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, owner of an empire that spanned various sectors of the British economy, was a constant presence there, in that place where life met its end and where memories seemed to gain more strength than anywhere else in the world. Every Monday, without fail, he would set aside the billion-dollar meetings of Montgomery Corp, the contracts that moved millions, the negotiations that defined the futures of hundreds of employees, to visit that place which held the memory of his younger brother, Thomas Montgomery, who had passed away 2 years prior under circumstances that still reverberated in his heart, like a painful unanswered echo. The report he had received at the time spoke of a traffic accident, a fatality like so many others that happen on British roads every day, but none of those cold, technical words filled the void Richard felt or convinced his restless soul that it had been just that, just a moment of distraction, just a second of carelessness that had stolen from his life the person he loved most, the younger brother he had always admired for his kindness, for his ability to see the world with gentler eyes than his own. As he placed a small arrangement of flowers on the cold marble, white flowers that Thomas had always appreciated, Richard sensed a different presence on that grey afternoon. It was a sound that didn't belong in the heavy silence of the cemetery, a sound that seemed out of place in that space of introspection and memory. It was sobbing, muffled and childlike, the kind you hear from someone trying to hide their own pain, trying to be strong when they are not yet old enough to understand the weight of absence. Turning slowly, with curiosity mixed with the concern any adult would feel upon finding a child alone in such a place, Richard spotted among the nearby headstones a little girl sitting on the wet ground, huddled beside an iron cross that marked an old, forgotten grave. Her tangled blonde hair fell over her small face, and she clutched a tattered stuffed rabbit to her chest, as if that object were the only thing keeping her connected to the real world. Her light blue dress was clean. Someone took good care of her, but it was clear that the garment was faded and worn from many washings, a sign that this child knew a reality very different from what Richard was used to seeing in his social circle. Despite the apparent emotional abandonment that showed in her slumped shoulders and her eyes red from crying, there was something in the way she embraced that grave that made Richard's heart ache in a way he hadn't expected, a pain that was not just his own, but seemed to be universal, shared by all those who know loss. With cautious steps, not wanting to frighten her or make her run away, Richard approached, not knowing exactly what to expect from this unusual situation. This child seemed to have no one else in the world, or at least that was the feeling she conveyed with her vulnerable posture and the way she clung to that piece of earth that held someone important to her. "Young lady, are you all right?" Richard's voice came out softer than he intended, laden with a genuine concern he didn't know he carried within himself. He had no children, had never dedicated time to starting a family, always too focused on building his empire, on proving his worth in a world that measured people by the size of their material achievements. The girl lifted her face and Richard could see her blue eyes, swollen from crying, eyes that seemed to carry a sadness far greater than a child should ever know. She stared at him for a long moment, as if assessing whether she could trust this stranger in an expensive suit and elegant posture, so different from the people who populated her daily life. "I come to talk to Thomas," she said finally, in a voice so low that Richard had to crouch down to hear her better. "He was my friend, my only real friend. He promised he would. He promised take care of me forever, but he went away and now I have no one." The impact of those words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Thomas? His brother? How was it possible that an unknown child knew his brother, spoke of him with such familiarity, with such affection, as if a bond existed between them that Richard was completely unaware of? In all the years he had lived with Thomas, in all the conversations they'd had, in all the Sunday lunches and family gatherings, never, absolutely never, had his brother mentioned a child, a friendship with a blonde, blue-eyed girl who now wept before his grave, as if mourning the loss of a father. "You knew my brother?" Richard asked, sitting on the damp ground beside her, not caring about the Italian suit that would surely be stained, not caring about the social conventions that said a man of his standing should not sit on a cemetery floor to talk to a strange child. The girl nodded, wiping tears with the back of her dirt-stained hand. "He came to see me every week. He brought books, taught me things, told me stories about places I'll never get to see. He said I was special, that I deserved a better life than the one I had. He said he was going to change everything, that he would make things different for me." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. This made no sense. Thomas was private, yes, but he never hid important aspects of his life. They were close, sharing not just blood and a surname, but also a genuine friendship built over years of companionship. How was it possible that such a significant part of his brother's life had remained hidden from him? "What's your name?" Richard asked gently, trying to organize the thoughts tumbling through his mind. "Sophie. Sophie Oliver," the girl replied, clutching the stuffed rabbit tighter, as if the gesture could bring back the sense of security Thomas's presence had provided. "Sophie, tell me something. Where do you live? Who takes care of you?" Richard needed to understand the situation, needed to know how this child fit into his brother's life, what role she played in this story he knew nothing about. The girl hesitated, biting her lower lip in a gesture that betrayed her insecurity. "I live with Mrs. Diana. She's nice. She looks after me and other children too. But it's not like before I had my mum and it was just the two of us. After she went away, everything changed. That's when Thomas showed up. He said he knew my mum, that she had been important to him, and that's why he was going to look after me." Richard felt he was facing something much bigger than he had initially imagined. This child's story was intertwined with his brother's in a way he didn't comprehend, but it sparked an intense curiosity and an urgent need to uncover the truth, to understand what had happened in the last years of Thomas's life, years in which his brother had apparently built a parallel life that no one in the family knew about. "Sophie, do you know where your mother is now?" Richard asked delicately, fearing the answer that might come, fearing to open wounds that might be too deep for such a small child. "She went away 2 years ago. People say she got sick and couldn't stay, but I know she didn't want to leave me. My mum loved me, I know it. She always told me I was the most important thing in her life," Sophie said with a conviction that broke Richard's heart, an innocent conviction that had not yet been completely shattered by life's hardships. "And after she was gone, Thomas started taking care of you?" Richard was assembling a puzzle in his mind, trying to fit the pieces Sophie offered him, trying to form a coherent picture of what had happened. "Yes. He showed up on the day of my mum's funeral. I'd never seen him before, but he knew my name, knew things about me. He said my mum had asked him to look. He said, out for me if anything happened to her. At first I was scared of him, but he was so kind, so gentle. He brought me presents, took me for ice cream, told me funny stories. He made me forget, at least for a little while, that my mum wasn't here anymore." Richard ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of this revelation. Thomas had taken responsibility for this child, had formed a bond with her, had become a father figure in her life, all without mentioning a single word to the family, without asking for help, without sharing, a burden that surely couldn't have been light. "Sophie, do you remember your mother's name?" Richard needed more information, needed details that would help him investigate this situation, to understand how Sophie's mother connected to Thomas. Jessica Oliver. She worked a lot, she was always tired, but she always made time for me. She said everything she did was for me, so I could have a better life than she did, Sophie said with pride, with the unconditional love only a daughter can have for her mother. The name echoed in Richard's mind like a distant bell, bringing with it a vague memory of something he had heard years ago, perhaps in a casual conversation, perhaps in a company meeting. Jessica Oliver. Why did that name seem familiar? Where had he heard that name before? "Sophie, tell me something. Did Thomas talk about me to you?" Did he mention his family? Richard needed to know to what extent his brother had shared his life with this child, how far this relationship he knew nothing about went. The girl nodded enthusiastically, and for the first time since Richard had found her, a small smile lit up her tear-streaked face. He talked about you a lot. He said you were his older brother, that you were very important, that you took care of everything. He said you were strong and smart, but that sometimes you got so busy you forgot to look at the things that really matter. He said it with affection. It wasn't a criticism. It was like he understood you had a lot of responsibilities. Richard felt a tightness in his chest, hearing those words from a child's mouth. Thomas knew him too well, knew exactly how he operated, how his life revolved around work, obligations, commitments that never seemed to end. And now, 2 years after his passing, it was an unknown child who brought him this message, who showed him a reflection of himself through his brother's eyes. "He wanted to tell you something very important," Sophie said suddenly, with a seriousness that didn't match her age. "A few days before he went away, he told me he had discovered something that would change everything, that he needed to talk to you, that you were the only person he could really trust. But he never got the chance, and now I don't know what to do with it, because he asked me to keep a secret, but I don't know if I should tell or if I should stay quiet." Richard felt his heart race. A secret. Thomas had a secret he wanted to share with him, something important enough to mention to a child, something that never reached his ears because life decided to interrupt that conversation before it could happen. "Sophie, look at me." Richard gently held the girl's small hands in his, looking deep into her blue eyes that seemed to carry far more wisdom than they should. "Thomas was my brother, and I loved him very much. If he wanted to tell me something, if he trusted you to keep it, then maybe it's time for you to tell me. I promise I will take care of you, just like he did. You're not alone, Sophie. Not anymore." The girl looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching the man's face for some resemblance to Thomas, some sign that she could trust him the way she had trusted his brother. And then, slowly, she began to speak, her voice trembling but determined. "He told me he discovered something at the company where you both worked. Something that wasn't right, something people were doing in secret. He said my mum helped him find out because she worked there too, in the part where she handled his private affairs. He said some people weren't honest, that they were doing wrong things and using your family's name for it. He was very worried, very nervous. He said he needed to gather proof, that he needed to be sure before talking to you, because it was something very serious." Richard felt as if the ground was disappearing from under his feet. Montgomery Corp was his life, the empire he had built with his father, which he had expanded with sweat and dedication over years of hard work. The idea that something wrong was happening there, under his nose, without his knowledge, was too disturbing to process at that moment. Thomas was investigating the company. He was discovering irregularities, Richard asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the whirlwind of emotions hitting him. "I don't really know what that means, what you said. But he said people were lying on papers, putting in wrong numbers, making deals that weren't real. My mum found some documents, some important papers, and showed them to him. That's when everything started to get strange. My mum got scared. Thomas got nervous, and a little while later my mum got sick and went away. And then Thomas went away too. And now I'm alone with this secret, and I don't know what to do." Sophie's words hit Richard like a series of punches, each revelation more impactful than the last. His brother was investigating something serious at the company, something involving falsified documents, fraudulent deals, dishonest people using the family name for their own ends. And Sophie's mother, Jessica, was involved somehow, had found evidence, had helped Thomas in his investigation. "Sophie, do you have anything that belonged to Thomas? Any paper? Anything he gave you to keep?" Richard needed evidence, something concrete that could guide him in this search for the truth that was beginning to unfold before him. The girl hugged the stuffed rabbit to her chest and nodded shyly. "He gave me this. He said I should take very good care of it, that one day someone would come to get what was inside. He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you, but only to you." He was very clear about that. Richard looked at the tattered toy the girl held so dearly, a common stuffed rabbit, worn by time and use, seemingly nothing special. But if Thomas had entrusted it to Sophie with such specific instructions, then there was surely something there he couldn't yet see, something hidden in that apparent simplicity. "Can you show me?" Richard asked gently, not wanting to force the situation, respecting the bond Sophie had with an object that represented so much more than a simple toy. Sophie looked at the rabbit for a long moment, as if saying goodbye to something precious, and then held it out to Richard with her two small hands. "Take good care of it. Thomas gave it to me for my birthday. It was the best present I ever got. He said rabbits bring good luck, that they know how to keep secrets better than anyone." Richard took the toy carefully, feeling its light weight in his hands, observing every detail of the object that had suddenly become a crucial piece in a puzzle he was still trying to assemble. The seams were worn in places, the fabric was faded, one of the ears was slightly crooked. It was a loved object, cared for, carried everywhere by a child who saw it as her most precious treasure. Examining it more closely, Richard noticed a small opening at the base of the rabbit, a seam that looked as if it had been recently unstitched and sewn back together, with uneven stitches that showed it hadn't been done by professional hands. His heart raced. Thomas had put something inside that toy. He had used Sophie's stuffed rabbit as a makeshift safe to store something he considered important enough to be protected with such care. "Sophie, can I open it here?" Richard showed her the uneven seam at the base of the toy, and the girl nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and expectation. With trembling fingers, Richard undid the stitches, feeling he was about to discover something that would change everything. Something that would shed light on the mysteries surrounding the last days of his brother's life. And then, from inside the cotton filling of the rabbit, he pulled out a small brown paper envelope sealed with adhesive tape, with the name Richard written in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. This was real. It wasn't a child's fantasy, not imagination. Thomas had truly left something for him, had created an elaborate plan to ensure this information reached his hands, had trusted a child to be the guardian of a secret he considered too precious to be lost. With shaking hands, Richard opened the envelope, feeling the rough paper under his fingers, and from inside he pulled out a single folded sheet and a small white card with an address written by hand. The letter was short, written in Thomas's hurried script as if he were in a rush, as if he knew time was running out. "Richard, if you're reading this, it means Sophie has completed the mission I gave her, and you finally discovered what I've been holding on to for months. It wasn't easy to keep this from you, but I needed to be sure, needed to gather enough proof before bringing this problem to you. Montgomery Corp is not what we think it is. There are people inside the company, people we trust, who are using our structure for activities that could destroy everything our father built. Jessica helped me uncover this. She was more than my secretary. She was someone who cared, who had the courage to do what was right even knowing the risks. Now she's no longer here to tell her side of the story, so it's up to me to do it for her. And if I'm not there either when you read this, then it's up to you to finish what we started. At the address I've left on this card, there's a law firm holding important documents. Use my name, show them this letter, and they will give you access to everything. Take care of Sophie for me. She's innocent in all of this, but she carries a weight too heavy for her small shoulders. Promise me you'll protect her. Promise me you'll find the truth. Your brother, who always loved you, Thomas." Richard read and reread those words several times, feeling each sentence like a blow to his chest, each revelation like a piece that finally fit into a puzzle he didn't even know he was trying to solve. Thomas knew. Somehow, his brother had sensed that something might happen to him, that his investigation could put him in danger, and so he had created this elaborate plan, had left. Clues had ensured the truth would not die with him. And Jessica. Now he understood who that woman was, why her name had seemed familiar. She was Thomas's personal secretary, the person who managed his personal schedule, his private correspondence, matters he preferred to keep away from the company's eyes. Richard had met her briefly on a few occasions, a discreet, competent, dedicated woman. He had never imagined she had a daughter, that this daughter was Sophie, the girl who now looked at him with hopeful eyes, awaiting some response, some reaction that would tell her everything would be okay. "Sophie, you are a very brave girl," Richard said finally, putting the letter in his inner jacket pocket and returning the stuffed rabbit to the child's eager hands. "Thomas was right to trust you. You kept his secret very carefully, and now I can do what he asked. I'm going to find out the truth, I'm going to fix what's wrong, and I'm going to take care of you. That's a promise." Sophie's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were not tears of sadness, but tears of relief, of hope, of gratitude for finally finding someone who understood, someone who believed her, someone who didn't just see her as another orphan lost in the system. "Are you really going to take care of me, like Thomas did?" she asked in a voice so vulnerable it broke Richard's heart. "I will, and I'll do more than that. I'm going to find out what happened. I'm going to honor the memory of my brother and your mother. I'm going to make sure their sacrifice was not in vain," Richard said with a conviction he didn't know he possessed, driven by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. As the sun began to set behind the dense clouds, painting the Manchester sky in shades of orange and purple, Richard and Sophie remained there, before Thomas's grave, united by a secret they now shared, united by a mission that had become theirs, united by a promise that needed to be kept. Richard knew that from that moment on, his life would change completely. He could no longer pretend he didn't know, could no longer continue his routine as if nothing had happened. There was a child who needed him, a truth that needed to be revealed, an injustice that needed to be corrected. And he, who had always prided himself on being a rational man, driven by logic and numbers, now found himself moved by something much deeper, much more human, much more real. As they walked together towards the cemetery exit, with Sophie holding his large, strong hand tightly, Richard looked back one last time, at the grave he visited religiously every Monday. But now that place had a different meaning. It was no longer just a point of mourning, of loss, of lament. It was the starting point of a journey that was just beginning, a journey that would lead him to discover truths about his brother, about his company, about his own family, truths that had been buried for far too long, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them to light. The city of Manchester was beginning to turn on its lights as night approached, and Richard knew he had a lot of work ahead of him. The address Thomas had left on the card would be his next destination, but first he needed to make sure Sophie was safe, that she had a place to stay where she would be properly cared. For while he conducted his investigation, "Let's go find Mrs. Diana," Richard said gently, crouching down to be at Sophie's eye level. "I need to talk to her, explain the situation, and see how we can make sure you're well looked after while I sort some things out. Do you trust me?" Sophie nodded, clutching the stuffed rabbit to her chest. "I trust you. Thomas said you were a good person, and he never lied to me." Those simple words, spoken with the innocent conviction of a child, touched Richard in a way he hadn't expected. How long had it been since someone saw him simply as a good person, without the layers of power, money, and influence that usually defined how people saw him? How long had it been since he himself had seen himself that way, beyond his titles and professional achievements? They left the cemetery together, an unlikely pair that would surely draw attention from anyone who saw them. The powerful businessman in an expensive suit, walking hand in hand with a little girl in a simple dress and a stuffed rabbit, united by circumstances neither had chosen but which now connected them irreversibly. The address where Diana lived was on the outskirts of Manchester, in a simple but tidy neighborhood, where the houses were modest but well kept, where people knew and helped each other. Richard drove his imported car through the narrow streets, feeling out of place in this environment, so different from his world of skyscrapers and luxurious offices. When they arrived in front of a small house with a green gate, Sophie squeezed his hand tighter. "This is it. Mrs. Diana is nice, but she looks after a lot of children. Sometimes I feel lonely even when I'm surrounded by people." Richard understood that feeling perfectly. He himself, surrounded by employees, partners, and associates, often felt profoundly alone, isolated in his world of responsibilities and difficult decisions. Loneliness wasn't about the number of people around, but the quality of the connections one made. They knocked on the door, and a middle-aged woman with grey hair tied in a bun and a floral apron opened it with a warm smile that turned to surprise upon seeing Sophie accompanied by a stranger in a business suit. "Sophie, where have you been? I was worried," Diana exclaimed, pulling the girl into a tight hug before turning her questioning gaze to Richard. "And you are?" "Richard Montgomery. A pleasure to meet you." Richard extended his hand formally, and Diana shook it cautiously, clearly confused by the unusual situation. "I need to talk to you about Sophie, about her mother, and about some circumstances involving my family. May we come in?" Diana hesitated for a moment, but Sophie's pleading look convinced her. "Of course, come in. But I can't be long. I have other children to look after." The house was small, but cozy, decorated simply but with a lot of care. Richard could hear children's voices coming from another room, laughter and conversations that filled the space with life and energy. Diana settled them in the small living room, offering coffee which Richard accepted more out of politeness than desire. Over the next hour, Richard told Diana everything he had discovered, omitting only the most sensitive details that might frighten or worry the woman too much. He explained his connection to Thomas, revealed that his brother had been responsible for Sophie's care after Jessica's passing, and expressed his desire to take on that role now that he had discovered the situation. Diana listened attentively, her eyes filling with tears at times, especially when Richard mentioned the affection Thomas had for Sophie and how important that bond had been for both of them. "I always knew there was something special about this girl's story. She talked so much about a man who visited her, who brought her presents, who made her smile. I thought it was a child's fantasy, a way of coping with her loss. I never imagined it was real, that there was someone truly looking after her." Richard felt a pang of guilt. If he had been more present in Thomas's life, if he had paid more attention to the details, perhaps he would have discovered this situation sooner, perhaps he could have helped in some way. But there was no point in punishing himself for the past. What mattered now was the present and the future, ensuring Sophie had the life she deserved, the life Thomas had dreamed for her. "I would like to start the process of becoming Sophie's legal guardian," Richard said firmly, surprising even himself with this decision he was making so suddenly, so instinctively. "I know this might seem hasty, but I feel it's what my brother would have wanted, what he would have expected of me. Obviously, this doesn't have to happen immediately. I want to do things the right way, go through the proper processes, ensure it's what's best for Sophie." Diana looked at the girl, who was watching the conversation in silence, her blue eyes darting from one adult to the other, trying to process all this new information. "Sophie, what do you think about that?" Diana asked gently. The girl looked at Richard for a long moment, and then a small smile lit up her face. "Thomas always said his brother was a good person. I think he would want us to be a family." Those simple words sealed the commitment Richard was making at that moment. He didn't know how he would balance his hectic business life with the responsibility of caring for a child. Didn't know if he was prepared for that role, but he knew it was the right thing to do, what his heart and his conscience demanded of him. As he drove back to his home that night, after leaving Sophie with Diana and promising to return the next day to start sorting out the legal matters, Richard felt different, transformed in a way he couldn't yet fully name. Thomas's envelope burned in his pocket, reminding him that a greater mission awaited him, a truth that needed to be discovered, an injustice that needed to be corrected. Arriving at his luxurious apartment in Manchester's most exclusive district, with a panoramic view of the illuminated city, Richard felt for the first time uncomfortable with all the excess, with all the luxury that seemed so empty compared to the genuine simplicity of Diana's home, to the sincere love Sophie showed despite having so little. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat in his leather armchair, and opened Thomas's letter again, reading each word with renewed attention, looking for details he might have missed on the first reading. The address of the law firm was written on the card, Costa and Lime, Solicitors, located in the city's historic centre. Richard decided he would go there the next morning. He couldn't postpone it, couldn't let more time pass without discovering what Thomas had found, without understanding the magnitude of the problem that apparently existed within his own company. Looking out the window at the city stretching below him, Richard made a silent promise to his brother. "I will find the truth, Thomas. I will protect Sophie as you protected her. I will get justice for you and for Jessica. No matter what I find, no matter who is involved, I will see this through to the end. You trusted me, and I will not let you down." The night advanced over Manchester, bringing with it the silence and stillness that always precede great discoveries, great changes, great revelations. And Richard, who once saw his life as a straight, predictable line of success and material achievements, now found himself at the beginning of a winding and uncertain journey, but one infinitely more meaningful than anything he had built so far. He didn't yet know what kind of truth he would find at the law firm, didn't know what kind of people would be involved in the irregularities Thomas had discovered, didn't know how it would affect his company, his family, his life. But he was ready to face it all, ready to do whatever was necessary, moved by a sense of purpose that had been dormant within him for too long. And somewhere on the outskirts of Manchester, in a simple house with a green gate, a little girl with blonde hair slept, hugging her stuffed rabbit, dreaming for the first time in 2 years of a future that could be different, of the possibility of no longer being alone, of the hope that maybe the promises adults made could actually come true. St. Francis of Assisi Cemetery remained silent under the night sky, its tombs guarding not only the bodies of those who had departed, but also the secrets that crossed generations, the truths that waited patiently to be discovered, the stories that refused to be forgotten as long as there was someone willing to listen to them. And so ended the first day of a journey that would forever change the lives of everyone involved, the first chapter of a story that was just beginning to unfold, the first step towards a truth that had remained hidden for too long, waiting for the right moment to emerge and transform everything. The morning dawned with a timid light that struggled to break through the persistent clouds over Manchester. Richard woke earlier than usual, after a night of restless sleep, filled with fragmented dreams where Thomas appeared, trying to say something important, but his voice was lost before the words could reach him. He prepared himself with his usual care, choosing a discreet but elegant suit, appropriate for the meeting he had ahead at the law firm. As he had his coffee, alone at the immense dining table that rarely saw company, Richard reflected on how drastically his life had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, he was just a businessman visiting his brother's grave, fulfilling a weekly ritual of mourning and remembrance. Today, he was a man with a clear mission, a defined purpose, and a child who depended on him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Mark Shaw, his old friend from university, who had pursued a career in the police force before retiring and opening his own private investigation agency. Richard had contacted him the previous night, asking for his help to discreetly investigate Sophie's situation and the last few months of Jessica Oliver's life. "Richard, I've got some preliminary information." Mark's deep voice came through the line, carrying the professional tone of someone used to handling sensitive information. Jessica Oliver did indeed work as Thomas's personal secretary for nearly 3 years. She was a discreet, competent woman, no history of problems, lived alone with her daughter in a modest flat in the North End. As for her death, the certificate indicates respiratory complications, pneumonia that progressed rapidly. Nothing apparently suspicious in the official records, but there are a few things that stand out. Richard pressed the phone to his ear, his attention fully focused. What kind of things? In the days leading up to her death, Jessica moved unusual amounts of money in her bank account, deposits that don't match her regular salary, and there are records of her visiting a notary's office 2 weeks before she fell ill to have some documents officially witnessed. I'm trying to find out what kind of documents they were, but that will take some time. Mark paused before continuing. And there's more. I found out she had a modest life insurance policy, but it clearly specified that Sophie should be placed under the guardianship of a Diana Fisher, the woman who's looking after her now, if anything happened. That was changed just a month before she passed. Before that, the designated guardian was someone else. Who? Richard asked, feeling his heart race. Your brother, Thomas. Montgomery was listed as Sophie's legal guardian if anything happened to her mother. But he changed it shortly before his own death, designating Diana in his place. It's as if he knew he wouldn't be available to fulfill that role. The impact of this information hit Richard with full force. Thomas hadn't just been looking after Sophie out of kindness or a casual sense of responsibility. He had legally committed to being her guardian, had formalized that relationship in a way that made it all much more real, much more profound. And then he had changed it, as if sensing something might happen to him, as if preparing for an eventuality that ultimately came to pass. "Mark, I need you to dig deeper into the last few months of my brother's life. I want to know who he was meeting, where he was going, what places he frequented. And I want to know everything about Jessica's last days, too. Any detail that seems out of the ordinary, anything that doesn't fit the normal pattern." Richard knew he was asking a lot, but he also knew Mark was the only person he could completely trust for this investigation. "I'll do it. But Richard, I have to warn you, if your brother was investigating something serious within Montgomery Corp, and if Jessica was involved, you could be stirring up a hornet's nest. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Mark's voice carried genuine concern, the concern of a friend who feared for the other's well-being. "I am. More than that, I have to. Not just for Thomas, but for Sophie, for Jessica, and for myself. I need to know the truth, Mark. No matter how painful it is," Richard said with a determination that surprised even himself. After ending the call, Richard quickly finished his coffee and headed towards Manchester's historic centre. The law firm Costa and Lime Solicitors was located in an old but well-maintained building on King Street, one of the city's most traditional thoroughfares, where historic architecture coexisted harmoniously with modern commercial establishments. Upon entering the office, Richard was greeted by a young secretary who immediately led him to an elegantly decorated meeting room, where a man of about 60 with grey hair and gold-rimmed glasses awaited him. "Mr. Montgomery, it's an honor to receive you." Mr. Ferdinand Lime extended his hand with a cordial yet professional smile. "When I received your call last night, I was intrigued. We've been waiting for this moment for 2 years. Richard shook the solicitor's hand and sat in the indicated chair. 2 years? You were expecting me specifically? Mr. Lime nodded gravely, opening a leather folder that was on the table. Your brother, Thomas Montgomery, came to us exactly 2 years and 3 months ago. He was visibly distraught, but determined. He said he needed a trustworthy firm, completely independent of Montgomery Corp, to safeguard extremely sensitive documents. We established an agreement. The documents would remain here, in our A vault, and would only be handed over to you personally, upon presentation of a specific letter he would leave in a safe place. I presume you found that letter? Richard took the envelope from his inner jacket pocket and placed it on the table. I found it yesterday, with Sophie, Jessica Oliver's daughter. The solicitor's face softened at the mention of the girl's name. Ah, yes. Sophie. Thomas spoke of her often. The affection he had for the child was evident. He also consulted us on matters of guardianship, wanting to ensure she would be protected if anything happened. It was one of the last things he dealt with here, days before his unfortunate passing. Mr. Lime stood up and walked to a safe built into the wall, protected by a digital lock. After keying in a sequence of numbers, he retrieved a metal box from inside and brought it to the table, placing it carefully in front of Richard. Here is everything your brother left for you. Documents, records, correspondence, and some personal notes. He asked me to tell you, when this moment came, that he was sorry for having to do this in secret, but that there was no other option. He trusted you completely, Mr. Montgomery, but he feared that other people within the company might intercept the information if he tried to deliver it directly. With trembling hands, Richard opened the metal box. Inside were several meticulously organized folders, each labeled with dates and titles indicating their contents: bank statements, service contracts, internal correspondence, financial reports. And at the bottom of the box, a black-covered notebook with Thomas's handwriting filling page after page. May I examine this here? Richard asked, feeling he needed privacy to process what he was about to discover. Of course. Take as much time as you need. I'll have coffee and water brought in. If you need anything, I'll be in the office next door. Mr. Lime discreetly withdrew, closing the door behind him and leaving Richard alone with the legacy Thomas had left behind. For the next 3 hours, Richard immersed himself in the documents with the intensity of someone unearthing carefully hidden truths. What he discovered was far worse than he had imagined. Thomas had found evidence of a sophisticated scheme to embezzle funds within Montgomery Corp. Overpriced contracts with shell companies, payments for services never rendered, financial transactions that did not correspond to the company's real operations. But what shocked him most was discovering the names involved. They weren't low-level employees taking advantage of loopholes. They were people in positions of trust, people Richard had known for years, people he considered allies and even friends. The name that appeared most frequently in the documents was Valerie Andrews, who had been Thomas's fiancée. She held a management position in the Tenders and Contracts Department of Montgomery Corp., a position that gave her privileged access to sensitive information and decision-making power over multi-million-pound contracts. According to Thomas's notes, Valerie was using her position to direct contracts to companies controlled by third parties, receiving substantial kickbacks under the table. Richard felt a mixture of anger and sadness as he read it. Valerie had been part of the family, or at least was about to become so. He knew her well himself, had always considered her a competent professional and a suitable partner for his brother. How must Thomas have felt upon discovering that the woman he loved was involved in such serious activities? Thomas's personal notebook provided emotional context to the cold financial documents. It was clear from the increasingly hurried handwriting and the anguish-laden observations that his brother was under immense emotional stress. Richard read passages that broke his heart. "I don't know how to confront her. Part of me still hopes there's an explanation, that somehow I'm misinterpreting the evidence. But the numbers don't lie, the companies are fronts, the payments are real, and Valerie is at the center of it all. How can I love someone and at the same time know that she is destroying everything our family has built?" Further on, another entry revealed Jessica's role in the discovery. Jessica was the one who first noticed the irregularities. She handled my personal correspondence and ended up seeing documents she shouldn't have. Instead of pretending she saw nothing, she came to me, concerned. She said she couldn't stay silent knowing something wrong was happening. I greatly admire her courage and integrity. She has a little girl, Sophie, and yet she's willing to take risks to do the right thing. I promised I would protect them, mother and daughter. I promised I wouldn't let anything bad happen to them because of this. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that unfulfilled promise. Thomas had tried to protect Jessica and Sophie, but circumstances hadn't allowed it. Now it was up to him to honor that promise, to ensure Sophie was safe and cared for, to ensure Jessica's sacrifice had not been in vain. The last entry in the notebook was dated 3 days before Thomas's passing. The handwriting was even more erratic, evidencing the urgency and fear he felt. "Valerie found out I'm investigating. I don't know how, but she knows. She tried to confront me today, alternating between attempts at seduction and veiled threats. She said, 'I don't understand how things really work in the business world, that everyone does it, that I'm being naive. But I know that's not true. There's a difference between being smart in business and being dishonest. I need to talk to Richard as soon as possible. I need to get all of this to him before it's too late. I've scheduled a meeting with him for Monday. I'll tell him everything. But as a precaution, I'm leaving these copies with Mr. Lime, and I'm giving Sophie an envelope with instructions. If something goes wrong, Richard will find out eventually. He was always the stronger of us two. He'll know what to do." Richard felt tears burn his eyes as he read those words. The Monday meeting never happened. Thomas passed away on Saturday, 2 days before the scheduled date. And for 2 years, that truth had remained hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Composing himself, Richard continued to examine the documents, making mental notes of everything that needed to be checked, of all the people who needed to be investigated. Besides Valerie, other names appeared frequently in the papers: Roger Campbell, the company's chief financial officer; Andrea Silverman, the human resources manager; Paul Harrison, head of the purchasing department. All of them, according to the evidence compiled by Thomas, were involved in the scheme at some level, some more deeply, others perhaps just turning a blind eye to irregularities they should have reported. But all shared responsibility for what was happening. Richard realized with growing horror that the problem wasn't just the financial embezzlement, as serious as that was. The problem was the moral corrosion that had taken root in the company, the normalization of dishonesty, the transformation of unethical practices into standard procedure. And he too focused on expanding the business, on closing new deals, on increasing profits, had noticed none of it happening right under his nose. A specific detail caught his attention in one of the documents. It was a series of bank transfers made by Thomas to Jessica's account in the weeks before her death. The sums were substantial, far beyond what a normal salary would be. There was a note attached written by Jessica herself. "Mr. Thomas, I don't feel comfortable accepting this money. I know you want to help, but this seems like too much. I'm afraid of what people might think, of what this might look like. You already do so much for me and Sophie with your attention and kindness." Thomas's reply was stapled just below. "Jessica, please accept it. You are taking risks by doing the right thing, by helping me uncover the truth. This is the least I can do. Use this money to secure Sophie's future, to have a reserve in case you need to leave the city quickly, in case the situation becomes dangerous. It's not a gift, it's a necessary precaution. And don't worry about what people might think. The only people whose opinions matter are those who know our true character." Richard then understood why Jessica had moved unusual amounts in her account in the days before her death, as Mark had reported. It was nothing suspicious or illicit. It was simply Thomas trying to protect her, trying to ensure that she and Sophie had resources if they needed to flee or hide. More proof of his brother's noble character, another reason to honor his memory by uncovering the whole truth. When Mr. Lime returned to the room, it was almost 2 in the afternoon. Richard had read and reread every document, absorbing every detail, processing every revelation. His expression must have conveyed the gravity of what he had discovered, because the solicitor observed him with evident concern. "Mr. Montgomery, I can imagine that what you found has not been easy to digest. Your brother carried this weight alone for months. He would come here regularly to update the documents, add new evidence, refine his conclusions. It was clear how much it tormented him." Richard nodded grimly. "Mr. Lime, I need your legal guidance. Based on what's here, what are my next steps? How can I expose these irregularities without completely destroying the company in the process?" The solicitor sat down again, lacing his fingers on the table in a thoughtful gesture. "This is an extremely delicate situation. If this information becomes public in a disorderly fashion, it could cause irreparable damage to Montgomery Corp's reputation, scare away investors, cause a steep drop in share value. But at the same time, you have a moral and legal obligation to correct these irregularities." "And what about the people involved? Valerie Andrews and the others?" Richard needed to know his options, what consequences their actions would have. "That depends on how far you want to go. You could opt for a discreet internal investigation, dismiss those involved for gross misconduct, implement new controls and move on. Or you could choose to involve the authorities, report it officially, turn it into a case that will be investigated externally. The first option protects the company's image, but allows the culprits to get off relatively lightly. The second option exposes everything publicly, but ensures there are real consequences for the acts committed." Richard remained silent for a long moment, weighing his options. The decision he made would affect not only his life, but the lives of hundreds of innocent employees at Montgomery Corp, of investors who trusted the company, of the legacy his father had built over decades. But it would also affect his own conscience, his ability to look at himself in the mirror, knowing he had done the right thing. "I'll need time to decide on the best course of action," Richard said finally. "But one thing is certain. I'm not sweeping this under the carpet. My brother died trying to do the right thing, and I will not dishonor his memory by choosing the easy way out." Mr. Lime nodded in approval. "Your brother said he could trust you. It's good to see he was right. I will. Prepare a detailed report on all these documents, organizing the evidence in a way that can be presented both internally and externally should you decide to go that route. And I will research legal precedents that can guide us on the best way to proceed." Richard thanked him and prepared to leave, taking copies of all the most important documents with him. As he left the building, he was hit by the sunlight that had finally managed to break through the persistent clouds. It was as if the universe was signaling that the truth, however difficult, always finds a way to emerge. But before returning to his office, before confronting those involved, before making any final decisions, there was something he needed to do. He needed to see Sophie, to make sure she was okay, to start building the relationship that Thomas had begun. He drove to Diana's house, calling ahead to let her know he was coming. When he arrived, he found Sophie in the small back garden playing with other children. Upon seeing him, her face lit up, and she ran towards him, still clutching the stuffed rabbit that Richard now knew was much more than a simple toy. "You came back," Sophie exclaimed, hugging his legs with the force of someone afraid the person might leave again. "I promised I'd be back, didn't I?" Richard crouched down to her level, noticing for the first time small details he had missed the day before. The way her blue eyes sparkled when she smiled, the dimple on her left cheek, the way she bit her lip when she was thoughtful. "Did you find out what Thomas wanted to tell you?" Sophie asked with the innocent curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned that some truths are too painful to be spoken easily. "I did. And you were right about everything. Thomas was indeed discovering important things, and your mother helped him a lot. They were very brave," Richard said softly, choosing his words carefully so as not to frighten or confuse the girl. "And now, what's going to happen?" The question was simple, but it carried all the weight of the uncertainty Sophie felt about her future. "Now I'm going to finish what Thomas started. I'm going to fix the things that were wrong. And I'm going to take care of you as I promised. We'll have to sort out some boring things with lawyers and papers, but in the end you'll have a real home, a real family," Richard said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. Sophie's face lit up with a hope that nearly broke Richard's heart. "Are you going to be like my dad? Like Thomas was being?" Richard swallowed the lump that formed in his throat. "I'm going to be your family. I don't know if I'll be very good at it at first, because I've never done this before. But I'm going to try with all my might. And when I get it wrong, you can let me know and we'll learn together, okay?" Sophie nodded vigorously, throwing her arms around Richard's neck in a spontaneous hug that took him completely by surprise. In that moment, feeling the thin arms of that child around him, Richard understood that his life had changed irrevocably. It was no longer just about finding the truth or fixing the company. It was about being responsible for another human being, for a child who depended on him for everything. Diana watched the scene from the porch with tears in her eyes. Later, when Sophie had gone back to playing with the other children, she invited Richard to talk in private. "Mr. Montgomery, I can see your intentions are sincere, but I must be honest with you. Raising a child is not like running a company. It's not about planning strategies or making rational decisions. It's about being present, about having patience, about giving unconditional love even when you're exhausted. Sophie has suffered too many losses in her life. If you take on this commitment and then give up, it will be devastating for her." Richard understood the woman's concern and respected it. She was right, to be cautious, to protect Sophie from another disappointment. "I understand your concerns and I share them. I won't pretend I know what I'm doing because I don't. But I can promise you that I am completely committed to this. Sophie is not a project or an obligation. She is the last connection I have to my brother. And more than that, she is a child who deserves to have a good, stable, loving life. I will do everything in my power to give that to her." Diana studied his face for a long moment before nodding. "I will support you in this. I'll help with the transition, teach you what I know about raising children, be available when you need it. Sophie deserves this chance, and from what I can see, so do you." Richard spent the rest of the afternoon with Sophie, getting to know her better, discovering her favorite games, her fears, her dreams. He found out she loved to draw, especially butterflies and flowers, that she was afraid of thunder, that she dreamed of seeing the sea, something she had never seen, that she loved adventure stories and always asked Thomas to make up new ones for her before bed. Every detail he discovered about Sophie deepened his commitment to making this relationship work. When he finally left late in the afternoon, promising to return the next day to take her to the park, Richard felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. Yes, there were immense challenges ahead. Yes, he had to deal with extremely difficult situations at the company. Yes, his life was being turned upside down. But for the first time in years, he felt he was truly living, not just existing. Upon returning to his apartment, he found several missed calls and messages from people at the company wanting to speak with him. Normally, he would have responded immediately, always available to solve problems and make decisions. But that night, he decided they could wait. There were more important things on his mind. He called Mark to update the investigator on what he had discovered at the law firm. Mark listened in silence, whistling softly when Richard mentioned the names of those involved. "This is big, Richard. Very big. You're talking about people in positions of power, with resources to defend themselves, possibly with contacts who can make things difficult. For you need to be very careful about how you proceed." Mark's voice was heavy with concern. "I know. That's why I need you to be discreet in your investigation. I don't want to alert anyone that we're looking into this until I've decided exactly what I'm going to do," Richard requested, aware of the risks he was taking. "You can count on me. And Richard, about Sophie. It's a good thing you're doing. Thomas would be proud," Mark said before hanging up, his words bringing comfort to Richard's heavy heart. That night, Richard sat in his armchair with a glass of red wine and Thomas's notebook. He read every page again, this time focusing not just on the information about the corruption scheme, but on the personal observations, the moments of doubt, the expressions of hope and fear his brother had recorded. One passage in particular touched him deeply. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing investigating this. It would be so much easier to just pretend I saw nothing, to get on with my life, marry Valerie, and be happy in ignorance. But then I look at Sophie, at that innocent little girl who trusts me, who believes that adults do the right thing, and I know I can't let her down. If I ignore this, if I let the corruption continue, what kind of example am I setting? What kind of world am I helping to build? No, I have to see this through, no matter the personal cost. I have to do this for Sophie, for Jessica, for Richard, for all the honest employees of the company who deserve to work in a place with integrity. And I have to do this for myself, so I can look at myself in the mirror and know I did what had to be done." Richard closed the notebook, tears streaming freely down his face. Thomas had been so young, so full of idealism, so determined to do the right thing despite knowing the risks. And now it was up to Richard to continue that mission, to finish what his brother had started. Looking out the window at the illuminated city of Manchester, Richard made a new promise, more specific and determined than the last. "I will expose everyone involved, Thomas. I will clean up the company. I will restore its integrity. I will do it the right way, with all the consequences that may bring. And I will raise Sophie as you would have, with love, with honesty, teaching her that doing the right thing is always worth it, even when it's hard." The phone rang again, but this time Richard answered. It was Andrea Silverman, one of the people mentioned in Thomas's documents as possibly being involved in the scheme. She wanted to schedule an urgent meeting to discuss some contract issues that needed his approval. Richard scheduled the meeting for the next day, but he had no intention of discussing contracts. He intended to observe her, to begin his own discreet investigation, to confirm Thomas's suspicions before taking any definitive action. He couldn't afford to rely solely on the documents. He needed more evidence, needed to be absolutely sure before ruining the careers and reputations of people he had known for years. As he prepared for bed, Richard reflected on how the past 2 days had completely transformed his perspective on life. He had discovered that his brother had lived a parallel life he knew nothing about, full of purpose and sacrifice. He had discovered that his company, his pride and joy, was being used for dishonest purposes by people he trusted. And he had discovered a child who needed him, who would make him question every priority he had set for his life until then. But as frightening as all this was, as uncertain as the future seemed, Richard felt a clarity of purpose he had never experienced before. He knew what he had to do. He knew who he wanted to be. And he knew that, no matter how difficult the path ahead, he was no longer alone. He had Thomas's memory to guide him. He had Sophie depending on him. And he had the truth as his ally. He fell asleep that night more peacefully than he had expected, dreaming of a future where Sophie ran through the garden of a spacious house, laughing freely, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected. And in this dream Thomas was there too, watching from a distance with a smile of approval, finally at peace, knowing his sacrifice had not been in vain. The days that followed were a roller coaster of emotions and discoveries for Richard. During the day he maintained his routine as a businessman, attending meetings, signing documents, making decisions that affected the direction of Montgomery Corp. But now, every interaction had an added layer of complexity. Every conversation with the executives Thomas had mentioned in his documents was scrutinized, every gesture interpreted, every word weighed for signs of guilt or innocence. Andrea Silverman arrived punctually for their scheduled meeting. She was a woman of about 40, always impeccably dressed, with a confident posture that had aided her rise through the company's hierarchy. Richard watched her enter his office with the attention of someone seeing a person for the first time, looking for signs he might have previously ignored. "Richard, thank you for seeing me on such short notice." Andrea sat in the chair opposite his desk, opening a folder filled with documents. "There are some contracts that need your urgent approval, renewals with suppliers who have been working with us for years." Richard took the documents and began to examine them with far more care than he normally would. He looked for the irregularities Thomas had mentioned, the signs of overbilling, the companies that might be fronts, and then he saw it. One of the contracts was with a company called Integrated Solutions Ltd., one of the same companies mentioned in Thomas's notes as being a front controlled by third parties. "Andrea, tell me a bit more about this company here," Richard said, pointing to the specific contract, carefully watching her reaction. There was a fleeting moment of tension on her face, so quick that a less observant person might have missed it. "Ah, yes. Integrated Solutions. They provide consultancy services for our human resources department. They've been working with us for about 3 years, always with excellent results." "And do you have access to the detailed reports of the services they provide?" Richard pressed, keeping his tone casual but observing every micro-expression. Andrea hesitated for a second before replying, "Of course, everything is properly documented. If you like, I can have their complete historical files brought over." "Yes, I'd like to see that. In fact, I'd like to review all the consultancy contracts we currently have active. I'm thinking of conducting a general audit to ensure we're getting the best value for our investments." Richard watched his words take effect. Andrea became visibly uncomfortable, shifting in her chair. "A full audit? That seems a bit extreme. Our processes already undergo regular checks," Andrea said, trying to keep her voice steady. But there was a note of defensiveness that did not go unnoticed. "Extreme or prudent? We have a responsibility to ensure that every pound spent by Montgomery Corp is invested efficiently. I'm sure that you, as the head of human resources, agree with that." Richard kept his gaze fixed on her, watching her struggle internally with something he couldn't quite decipher. "Of course. Of course." Andrea quickly recomposed herself. "I'll arrange for all the documents you've requested. How much time do you have to approve these contracts? Some of them have tight deadlines." "I'll need a few days to review everything properly. You can leave it with me. I'll be in touch once I have a decision." Richard signaled that the meeting was over, and Andrea left, visibly perturbed, though she tried to mask it with a veneer of professionalism. As soon as she was gone, Richard called Mark. "I need you to do a deep dive on a company called Integrated Solutions Ltd. I want to know who the real owners are, where it operates, what kind of services it actually offers, and I need it urgently." Mark was already working on several fronts of the investigation and promised to prioritize it. Meanwhile, Richard decided it was time to confront the person whose name appeared most in Thomas's documents, Valerie Andrews. He hadn't seen Valerie since she disappeared shortly after Thomas's funeral 2 years ago. At the time, everyone thought she was simply too devastated by the loss to continue working at the company, where every corridor reminded her of the man she loved. Some colleagues mentioned she had moved to another city. Others said she had sought psychological treatment to cope with the trauma. Richard never investigated deeply, respecting her grief and her need for distance. But now, knowing what he knew, that convenient disappearance took on a new meaning. Valerie hadn't fled from the pain of loss. She had fled from the weight of guilt, from the possibility of being discovered, from the confrontation with the consequences of her actions. Mark managed to locate her in Brighton, where she was living under her maiden name, working as an independent consultant. Richard decided to make a surprise trip there, without prior notice. He wanted to see her reaction to finding him unexpectedly, wanted her to have no time to prepare a story or build defenses. On Friday morning, Richard boarded a flight to Brighton, but before he left, he stopped by Diana's house to say goodbye to Sophie, who was already beginning to look forward to his daily visits with growing anticipation. "Will you be long?" Sophie asked, holding his hand tightly, her blue eyes reflecting concern. "I'll only be gone for a day. I'll be back tomorrow night." Richard crouched to her level, noticing that he was already starting to memorize the little quirks of her face, the details that made her unique. "Are you going to meet bad people?" The question took Richard by surprise. Sophie had an impressive intuition for such a young child. "I'm going to meet people who did wrong things, but don't worry, I'll be fine. And when I get back, we'll do something fun together. What would you like to do?" Richard tried to shift the conversation to something lighter. Sophie's face lit up. "Can we go to the park? The big one with the colorful slides? Thomas always promised to take me there, but we never got to go." Richard felt a pang in his chest upon hearing that, another promise Thomas hadn't been able to keep, another responsibility that now fell to him. "Then let's do that. Sunday afternoon I'll pick you up and we'll spend the whole day at the park. You can choose all the rides you want, we'll have popcorn, ice cream, anything you want." Sophie threw her arms around him, and Richard felt his heart tighten with a mixture of tenderness and determination. This child deserved to have a life full of fulfilled promises, happy moments, and good memories to compensate for all the losses she had suffered. The flight to Brighton was smooth, and Richard used the time to mentally review everything he knew about Valerie. She and Thomas had met at the company, where she had started as an intern before being hired full-time and quickly promoted. She was competent, ambitious, charismatic. Thomas had fallen for her almost immediately, and for 2 years everyone thought they were the perfect couple. That marriage was just a matter of time. But then, Thomas discovered the irregularities, and according to his notes, when he confronted Valerie, she first tried to seduce him into forgetting what he'd found, then tried to convince him it was normal in the business world, and finally threatened him vaguely, saying he didn't understand who he was messing with. Richard arrived in Brighton in the early afternoon and went directly to the address Mark had provided, a flat in an upper-middle-class complex in the Brighton Marina area. He went up to the 4th floor and rang the bell, his heart beating faster than he expected. The woman who opened the door was recognizable, but different. Valerie had lost weight. Her once long and carefully styled hair was now shorter and more practical. There were lines of exhaustion on her face that hadn't been there 2 years ago, but what struck Richard most was the look of pure terror that crossed her face upon seeing him standing at her door. "Richard," the word came out as a strangled whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I think you know exactly why I'm here, Valerie. We can talk in the hallway, or would you prefer to let me in?" Richard kept his voice calm but firm. Valerie hesitated, looking around as if hoping someone would appear to save her. Then, resigned, she opened the door and gestured for him to enter. The flat was modestly furnished, a far cry from the luxurious lifestyle she had maintained at Montgomery Corp. There were still unopened boxes in some corners, as if she hadn't fully settled in yet, or as if she were ready to leave again at any moment. They sat in the small living room, and for a long moment they just looked at each other in silence. Valerie seemed to have aged years in just 2, as if the weight of guilt had taken its physical toll. "You found out." It wasn't a question, but a statement, and her voice was heavy with resignation. "I found out. Thomas left everything documented. Every transaction, every fraudulent contract, every shell company, and he left a letter explaining your involvement." Richard saw no reason to soften the blow or pretend. He wanted to see how she would react to a direct confrontation. To his surprise, Valerie didn't deny it, didn't try to defend herself or make excuses. She just closed her eyes and nodded slowly, as if a huge weight was finally being lifted from her shoulders. I knew this day would come. I knew I couldn't run forever. So it's true. Everything in the documents is true. Richard needed to hear it from her, needed the confirmation from her own mouth. It's true. Valerie opened her eyes and Richard could see tears forming. But it's not the whole truth. There are things Thomas didn't know, things he didn't have time to find out before he passed. Richard finished the sentence, carefully watching her reaction. Valerie sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I didn't want that to happen. You have to believe me. I loved Thomas. I really did. But I got involved in something much bigger than me, something I couldn't control, and by the time I wanted out, it was too late. Tell me everything, from the beginning. Richard leaned forward, needing to understand how it had all started, how a competent professional had turned into someone involved in corporate fraud. Valerie stood up and went to the kitchen, returning with a glass of water which she drank nervously before she began to speak. It started 4 years ago. I was handling some supplier contracts when I was approached by a man named Robert Andrews. He introduced himself as a business consultant and said he could help me optimize the company's contracting processes, reduce costs, increase efficiency. At first, it seemed legitimate. Everything was very professional. And what changed? Richard asked, though he could already guess the answer. He started suggesting small changes to the contracts, slightly higher values here, slightly vaguer specifications there. He said that's how the market worked, that all the big companies did it. And he offered me a commission for every contract I approved following his guidelines. At first it was small amounts, a few £1,000s. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, that it was just a performance bonus, that I deserved it for helping the company grow. But the amounts grew larger, Richard stated, familiar with how such schemes worked, starting small to normalize unethical behavior before escalating. Yes, over time the commissions got bigger, the contracts more substantial, and by then I was in deep, receiving sums I couldn't explain with my salary. I was afraid to stop, afraid Robert would report me, afraid of losing everything. So I continued, justifying to myself that I wasn't really hurting anyone, that Montgomery Corp was rich enough to absorb those extra costs. And Thomas found out, Richard said, feeling anger but also a strange compassion for this woman who had clearly lost her way in a maze of bad choices. Thomas found out. Valerie wiped away the tears that were now streaming freely down her face. And when he confronted me, I panicked. I tried everything to get him to stop investigating. I tried to seduce him, remind him of what we had, the future we had planned. I tried to convince him it was normal, that he was being naive. And when none of that worked, You threatened him, Richard completed, remembering the words in Thomas's notebook. It wasn't me who threatened him, it was Robert. When I told him Thomas was investigating, he was furious. He said I'd been careless, that I'd put everything at risk. And then he said he would take care of the problem, that he would make Thomas understand the gravity of the situation. I didn't know what he meant by that, I swear I didn't. But you suspected, Richard said, noting how Valerie avoided his gaze as she spoke. I suspected, and I was terrified. I tried to warn Thomas, tried calling him several times over the next few days, but he wouldn't take my calls. He was angry with me, disappointed, and he had every right to be. And then her voice broke, and she needed a moment to compose herself before continuing. And then it happened, the accident, and I knew immediately it hadn't been an accident. Are you saying Robert had something to do with the situation that led to Thomas's death? Richard felt his blood run cold. Valerie's words were transforming his understanding of the entire situation. I have no proof. I never had the courage to investigate because I was afraid he would do the same to me. That's why I disappeared right after the funeral. That's why. I moved, cut all ties with my former life. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that it really had been just a tragic accident. But deep down, I always knew the truth. Richard was silent for a long moment, processing these revelations. If Valerie was telling the truth, then everything was much worse than he had imagined. This wasn't just about corporate fraud. It was about something far more serious, something he needed to handle with extreme care. "Who is Robert Andrews? Where can I find him?" Richard asked, his voice laced with a cold determination. Valerie shook her head vigorously. "Richard, please. You don't understand who you're dealing with. Robert isn't just a dishonest consultant. He has connections, resources, people who work for him. If you start investigating him, you'll put your life in danger, just like Thomas did. Do you think I'm going to let this go? Do you think I'll pretend I know nothing out of fear? My brother lost his life trying to do the right thing. I will not dishonor his memory by being a coward," Richard said, with a vehemence that made Valerie flinch. "Then at least be smart about it. Don't go after Robert alone. Don't trust anyone at the company until you know exactly who else is involved. And please protect yourself," Valerie pleaded, and Richard could see that despite all her mistakes, she genuinely cared for his well-being. "I need everything you know about Robert. Addresses, phone numbers, names of people who work with him, companies he controls, everything." Richard wasn't asking. He was demanding. Valerie hesitated, clearly torn between fear of retaliation and the need to finally do something right. Finally, she stood up and went to a cupboard from which she retrieved a small box hidden at the back. From inside, she took out a USB drive. "It's all here, everything I managed to gather before I ran. Information on Robert, on the companies, on others involved in the scheme. I kept it as an insurance policy, something I could use to protect myself if he came after me." She held out the USB drive to Richard with trembling hands. "Use it carefully, and if you can bring him down, if you can get justice for Thomas, then maybe I can finally have some peace." Richard took the USB drive, carefully placing it in his pocket. "One last question. Jessica Oliver, Thomas's secretary, was she involved in this in any way?" Valerie shook her head emphatically. "No. Jessica was one of the only genuinely honest people in that company. That's why Thomas trusted her when he discovered the irregularities. She helped him gather evidence, organize the documents. After Thomas passed, I was afraid Robert would go after her too, but then I heard she had fallen ill and then passed away as well. It was so convenient that—" "That you think it wasn't natural," Richard finished the thought, feeling a wave of anger and sadness. "I have no proof. But yes, I've always wondered if she wasn't silenced in some way too," Valerie admitted, her voice breaking again. Richard stood to leave, but stopped at the door and turned to look at Valerie one more time. "You're going to have to testify officially about all of this. You'll have to face the consequences of your actions. But if you cooperate fully, if you help me put Robert and everyone else involved behind bars, I'll do what I can to ensure you're treated with some leniency." Valerie nodded, looking simultaneously terrified and relieved. "I'll cooperate. It's the least I can do. I'll never be able to make up for what I did. I'll never be able to bring Thomas back, but if I can help bring about justice, then at least I'll have done one thing right." Richard left the flat with his head spinning. What had started as an investigation into corporate fraud had turned into something much more sinister. If Valerie was telling the truth, if Robert had indeed had something to do with what happened to Thomas and possibly Jessica, then he was dealing with something far more dangerous than he had imagined. On the flight back to Manchester that night, Richard examined the contents of the USB drive Valerie had given him, using his laptop with extreme care to ensure no one around could see the screen. What he found confirmed and expanded on everything Thomas had discovered. Robert Andrews wasn't just an individual criminal. He operated a sophisticated network of shell companies, using Montgomery Corp and likely other large corporations as vehicles for money laundering and embezzlement. There were names of influential people involved, not just within Montgomery Corp, but in other organizations as well. Politicians, other businessmen, even some members of the police. Richard understood why Thomas had been so cautious, why he had kept everything secret until he was absolutely sure. One false step, one word to the wrong person, and everything could have been buried, just as Thomas and Jessica apparently had been. When he arrived back in Manchester, it was late at night, but instead of going home, Richard went directly to Mark's office. He needed to share this information with someone he trusted, needed help deciding on the next steps. Mark listened to everything in silence, his expression growing graver as Richard recounted his conversation with Valerie. Anne showed him the contents of the USB drive. When Richard finished, the investigator was silent for a long moment before speaking. "Richard, this is much bigger than any of us imagined. If half of what's on here is true, you're dealing with a sophisticated criminal organization with tentacles in various sectors. This isn't something you can solve on your own, or even with my help. You need to involve the federal authorities, people who have the resources and jurisdiction to investigate this properly. But how do I know who to trust if there are police involved, if there are politicians involved? How do I ensure I don't hand this over to someone in Robert's pocket?" Richard expressed the fear that had been growing inside him since he'd read the names on the drive. "I have a few contacts in the National Crime Agency, people I know personally who I know are straight. I can make a discreet approach, see if we can set up a controlled operation, but in the meantime, you need to act normally. You can't give any sign that you know all of this. If Robert suspects you're investigating, he might try to silence you the same way he possibly silenced Thomas." The direct mention of Thomas's possible fate made Richard shudder. For the first time since this journey began, he felt real fear. Not fear for himself, but fear of leaving Sophie alone again, fear that she would lose another important person in her life. "I'll be careful, but I'm not stopping. I can't," Richard said with determination, though his voice betrayed a hint of the anxiety he felt. Mark placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know. I've known you long enough to know that when you make up your mind, you see it through. Just promise me you'll be smart about it. Don't take unnecessary risks, and consider protecting yourself, maybe hire personal security, at least temporarily." Richard nodded, understanding the wisdom of the advice. Before leaving, he made one more request of Mark. "I need you to have someone watch Sophie and Diana too. If Robert finds out I'm investigating, he might try to get to me through them. I can't let anything happen to that girl." "I was already thinking about it. I'll put my best men on discreet surveillance. They won't even know they're being protected," Mark assured him, and Richard felt a small sense of relief, knowing Sophie would be safe. When he finally got home that night, Richard was physically and emotionally exhausted. The trip to Brighton, the confrontation with Valerie, the disturbing revelations, it had all taken its toll. But he couldn't rest yet. He had to review all the documents one more time, had to start planning his strategy, had to decide exactly how he would proceed. His phone rang, and he almost didn't answer, assuming it was work-related. But then he saw it was Diana calling, and his heart immediately quickened with concern. "Diana? Has something happened? Is it Sophie?" Richard asked quickly, his fatigue instantly replaced by alertness. No, everything's fine," Diana hurried to reassure him. "Sophie's asleep. Actually, she asked me to call you before she went to bed, to make sure you were okay. She was very worried when you said you were traveling. She made me promise I would check on you." Richard felt his heart warm at this display of concern. "You can tell her when she wakes up that I'm fine, that the trip was smooth, and that I can't wait for our trip to the park on Sunday." "I will." Diana paused before continuing. "Mr. Montgomery, can I say something? Over the past few days, I've seen Sophie more cheerful than she has been in 2 years. She talks about you all the time, tells the other children about the things you're going to do together. You're making a real difference in her life. I just wanted you to know that." After ending the call, Richard sat in his armchair and, for the first time, allowed himself to fully process everything that was happening. His life had been completely transformed in a matter of days. He had discovered his brother had possibly been silenced for investigating corruption. He had discovered a criminal organization was using his company for illicit purposes. And he had discovered a child who needed him, who saw him as her only source of stability and security in a world that had already taken so much from her. The weight of all these responsibilities was immense, but Richard felt strangely at peace with it. For the first time in his life, he felt he was living with real purpose, that his actions had meaning beyond accumulating wealth or expanding business. He was fighting for justice, protecting an innocent child, honoring his brother's memory. In the days that followed, Richard continued his investigation with extreme care. He met with Mark's contacts at the National Crime Agency, handing over copies of all the documents in a discreet meeting outside the city. They were impressed with the quantity and quality of the evidence Thomas had compiled and assured him they would launch an official investigation using resources that would not alert those involved. Meanwhile, at the company, Richard began to make subtle changes. He implemented new approval processes for contracts, brought in external auditors to review the finances, and created additional layers of verification that would make it much harder for any corruption scheme to continue operating undetected. Andrea Silverman noticed the changes and became visibly nervous. Roger Campbell, the CFO, also began to act strangely, avoiding face-to-face meetings with Richard and communicating primarily by email, where his responses were carefully calculated. Richard knew he was tightening the net, but he tried to do it in a way that seemed like a normal renewal of business processes, not a targeted investigation. He needed them to feel secure enough to continue their activities while the NCA built its case. And through it all there was Sophie. His daily visits to Diana's house became the highlight of each day, the time when he could temporarily forget about fraud and danger and just be a normal person talking to a child about simple things like cartoons, favorite books, and what she wanted for dinner. When Sunday arrived, Richard kept his promise and took Sophie to the park. He spent the entire afternoon with her, pushing her on the swings, watching her go down slides, eating popcorn and ice cream until they were both too full to continue. Seeing the radiant smile on Sophie's face, hearing her genuine peals of laughter, Richard knew with absolute certainty that everything he was fighting for was worth it. On the way back, with Sophie asleep in the back seat of the car, clutching her stuffed rabbit, Richard made another silent promise. "I will protect her, Thomas. I will give her the life you wanted her to have. I will get justice for you and for Jessica, and I will make sure Robert and everyone else involved pays for what they did. This is a promise I will keep no matter what happens." He didn't yet know that he was about to enter the most dangerous phase of this entire journey, that the revelations he had uncovered were just the tip of the iceberg, and that the full truth was even more shocking than anything he had imagined so far. The following weeks brought an intensity that Richard had never experienced in his life. By day, he maintained his facade as a businessman focused on optimizing processes and expanding the business, attending meetings, signing documents, and making decisions that kept Montgomery Corp running as usual. But beneath this surface of normality, a complex operation was underway, carefully coordinated between him, Mark, and the agents from the National Crime Agency, who were now investigating the scheme Thomas had uncovered. The legal process for Sophie's guardianship was also moving forward. Richard had hired the best family law solicitors in Manchester, and they were working diligently to ensure all the necessary paperwork was prepared properly. Diana continued to care for Sophie during the transition, but they had already begun preparations for the girl to move into Richard's home once the guardianship was official. This meant Richard had to transform his bachelor pad into a suitable home for a child. He hired an interior designer specializing in children's rooms, and together they created a space he hoped Sophie would love. Walls painted a soft, sky-like blue, shelves filled with books, a desk where she could draw and do her homework, and a comfortable bed with duvet covers decorated with butterflies. As he had learned, Sophie was fascinated by the delicate insects. But while building this future with Sophie, Richard was also preparing for the final confrontation he knew was coming. The NCA had managed to gather substantial evidence against Robert Andrews and his network of fraudulent companies. They had traced financial transactions, identified other victims besides Montgomery Corp, and documented years of criminal activity. And they were ready to act. The plan was to execute a coordinated operation, arresting all the main players simultaneously so that no one would have time to destroy evidence or alert the others. Richard would be informed the moment the operation began, but until then, he had to continue acting normally so as not to raise suspicion. It was on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after his trip to Brighton, that things began to happen. Richard was in his office reviewing financial reports when Mark called, his voice urgent. "Richard, we've just received intel that Robert has been spotted in Manchester. It seems he's planning to meet with someone from Montgomery Corp tonight. The NCA wants you to stay at home, away from any potentially dangerous situation." "Who's he meeting? Is it one of the executives we know are involved?" Richard asked, feeling adrenaline course through his veins. We don't know yet. They're tracking his movements, but they have to do it discreetly so as not to alert him. I'm just letting you know so you can stay safe, and so you know that the operation will likely happen in the next 48 hours. After ending the call, Richard tried to continue working but found himself unable to concentrate. His mind kept returning to Thomas, to everything his brother had discovered, to the price he had paid for trying to do the right thing. And he thought of Sophie, of how different her life would be when all of this was finally resolved, when she could live without the weight of secrets and dangers hanging over her. He decided to leave the office early and spend the afternoon with Sophie. When he arrived at Diana's house, he found the girl in the garden drawing in a large sketchbook he had given her. She was so engrossed in her drawing that she didn't notice his arrival until he sat down beside her on the grass. "What are you drawing?" Richard asked gently, looking at the colourful shapes that covered the paper. "It's our future," Sophie said simply, turning the sketchbook so he could see it better. "Here's you, here's me. And that's Thomas watching us from up there. He's happy because we're together now." Richard felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the drawing. Sophie had captured, with simple yet expressive lines, a family scene with him and her holding hands, and above them, a figure that clearly represented Thomas, drawn as if among the clouds, smiling. "It's beautiful, Sophie. You're very talented," Richard said sincerely, putting his arm around her shoulders. "The solicitor said I'll be able to live with you for real soon." Sophie looked at him with hope in her blue eyes. "Is that really true? You're not going to change your mind?" "It's true. And no, I'm not going to change my mind. I've already prepared a special room for you, with everything a girl could want. I can't wait to show you," Richard assured her, feeling both the responsibility and the privilege of being the person this child trusted completely. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, talking about plans for the future, about the school Sophie would start attending, about hobbies she wanted to try. Richard discovered she was interested in learning the piano and immediately decided to hire a private tutor for her. He found out she loved animals but had never had a pet and promised they would consider adopting a dog or cat when she moved in. It was starting to get dark when Richard's phone rang. It was Mark again, but this time his voice carried a different kind of urgency. "Richard, you need to go back to your place now. The NCA has identified that Robert is on his way to your residence. We don't know exactly what he's planning, but you can't be there when he arrives. We've already dispatched a team to intercept him, but we need you to stay away." Richard's blood ran cold. Robert knew where he lived. He was on his way there. What was he planning? A threat? A confrontation? Something worse? "I'm staying here with Sophie. Let me know as soon as the situation is resolved," Richard said, deciding that the safest place for him was right there, with the girl he had promised to protect. The next few hours were an agonizing wait. Richard tried to maintain a calm appearance for Sophie's sake, but internally he was on high alert, his phone always in hand, waiting for news. Diana sensed something was wrong and kept the other children occupied in another room, giving Richard and Sophie some privacy. Finally, just after 9:00, Mark called again. "We got him. Robert was intercepted by the NCA as he was trying to enter your building. He had a gun, Richard. We don't know exactly what he intended to do, but it clearly wasn't anything good. The operation has been moved up, and simultaneous arrests are being made in several locations right now." Richard felt a mix of relief and terror. A gun. Robert was armed and on his way to his home. If it hadn't been for the NCA's surveillance, if he had arrived home unprepared, what would have happened? And the others involved? Valerie? "The company executives," Richard asked, needing to know the extent of the operation. "Valerie is in protective custody as a cooperating witness. Andrea Silverman and Roger Campbell have been arrested at their homes. Paul Harrison tried to flee but was caught at the airport. There are other arrests happening now, people we're still identifying as part of the network. It's a big operation, Richard. It'll be all over the news tomorrow." "And the company? What happens to Montgomery Corp now?" Richard asked, concerned about the impact this would have on the innocent employees, on legitimate contracts, on everything he and his father had built over decades. "That will largely depend on how you manage the situation. The NCA is willing to work with you to minimize the impact on the company. They'll release a statement saying you cooperated actively with the investigation, that the irregularities were committed by dishonest executives without your knowledge or approval. If you act quickly to implement reforms, to demonstrate full transparency, there's a good chance Montgomery Corp will come out of this with its reputation relatively intact. After the call ended, Richard sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything that had happened. It was the end of the journey that had begun weeks ago in a cemetery, when a crying girl beside a grave had changed his life forever. The scheme had been exposed, the guilty were being held accountable, and the truth that Thomas had died trying to reveal was finally coming to light. Sophie was asleep on the sofa beside him, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. Richard watched her tenderly, thinking about all she represented, how an innocent child had been the key to unraveling this whole conspiracy, how wise his brother had been to trust her with his secrets. Diana came into the living room bringing coffee for Richard. "Is everything all right?" she asked quietly, so as not to wake Sophie. "It is now," Richard replied, gratefully accepting the cup. "It's been a long journey, but we've finally reached the end. There's finally going to be justice." "And Sophie? What happens to her now?" Diana asked, though she already knew the answer. "She's coming to live with me. As soon as the guardianship paperwork is finalized, probably next week, she'll have a permanent home. She'll have stability, she'll have someone to look after her, to love her. As Thomas loved her," Richard said with a conviction that came from the bottom of his heart. Diana smiled through tears. "You've become a different man these past few weeks. When we first met, you were just a powerful businessman doing charity. Now you're a father. It's beautiful to see." Diana's words echoed in Richard's mind as he finally drove home that night after Sophie had woken up and he was able to say a proper goodbye, promising to pick her up early the next day. A father. He had never thought of himself in those terms, had never planned to have children, always too focused on his career to consider that path. But now it was exactly what he was becoming, and he was discovering it was the most important role he had ever played in his life. The following days were chaotic. As Mark had predicted, the police operation dominated the news. The arrest of Robert Andrews and his corporate fraud network was the headline in every newspaper and on every news site. Montgomery Corp was at the center of the attention, and Richard had to give several press conferences, explaining his cooperation with the investigation and demonstrating the measures he was implementing to ensure nothing similar could happen again. The public reaction was mostly positive. Instead of seeing Richard as complicit or negligent, most people saw him as a victim who had acted heroically by exposing the corruption within his own company. The fact that he had honored his brother's memory by continuing the investigation Thomas had started added an emotional layer to the story that resonated with the public. Montgomery Corp's shares took an initial dip when the news broke, but quickly recovered as investors realized the company was under new, more ethical and transparent management. Richard implemented sweeping reforms, brought in new executives with impeccable reputations, and established an independent ethics committee to oversee all major operations. But amidst all that professional turmoil, Richard's priority remained clear: Sophie. A week after the arrests, when the paperwork was finally finalized and official guardianship was granted to him, Richard organized a small celebration to mark the moment Sophie officially became part of his family. Diana was there, along with Mark and a few other close friends, but the most emotional moment was when Richard took Sophie to see her new room for the first time. The girl's eyes widened as she entered the space that had been prepared especially for her, a place that was all her own, where she could be a child without worries or fears. "Is this all mine?" Sophie asked in disbelief, running from one corner of the room to the other, touching the books, admiring the desk, and jumping on the bed to test its softness. "All yours. This is your home now, Sophie. Forever," Richard said, watching the girl's radiant happiness with a warmth in his chest he had never felt before. That night, as Sophie finally settled into her new bed, Richard sat beside her for the first of many future bedtime conversations. Sophie held her stuffed rabbit, but now there was also a new teddy bear Richard had bought, and a small framed photo of Thomas on the bedside table. "Do you think Thomas is happy for us?" Sophie asked sleepily, her eyes beginning to close from the excitement of the day. "I'm absolutely sure he is," Richard replied, tucking the duvet around her. "He wanted you to be happy, to have a family, to have a bright future. And now you have all of that, and so do I, because you gave me something I didn't even know was missing from my life." "What?" Sophie asked, fighting sleep to hear the answer. "A purpose, a reason to be not just successful but good, a reason to wake up every day wanting to be a better person. You gave me all of that, Sophie, so really I should be thanking you." Sophie smiled sleepily and closed her eyes, murmuring one last phrase before falling completely asleep. "Love you, Dad." The words hit Richard like a bolt of lightning, so powerful and transformative that he needed a moment to process what he had just heard. Dad. She had called him Dad, and he realized that was exactly what he was now, not by biology or by accident, but by choice, by commitment, by love. "I love you too, sweetheart," Richard whispered, kissing her forehead gently before leaving the room, leaving the door ajar and the hallway light on, just as Sophie had asked, because she was still a little afraid of the total darkness. In the months that followed, Richard's life found a new rhythm. Mornings were about making breakfast for Sophie, making sure she was ready for school, talking about the dreams she'd had the night before. Days were about managing Montgomery Corp, which was thriving under his new ethical leadership, and attending meetings with the NCA as the case against Robert and his accomplices progressed through the justice system. Afternoons were about picking Sophie up from school, listening to her talk excitedly about what she had learned, about her new friends, about the teacher she adored. Evenings were about family dinners, helping her with homework, watching cartoons together on the sofa and reading stories before bed. It was a completely different life from the one Richard had lived before, but he found he wouldn't trade it for anything. Yes, there were still challenges. There were nights when Sophie woke up crying, dreaming of her mother or of Thomas, and Richard had to comfort her, remind her that she was loved, that she would never be alone again. There were moments of frustration when he didn't know how to handle a situation, when his business instincts didn't translate into parenting skills, and he had to ask Diana for help or read books on raising children. But there were also moments of pure, simple joy, like when Sophie won her first art competition at school and ran to show him the certificate, her eyes shining with pride, like when she finally lost her first baby tooth and was fascinated by the tradition of the tooth fairy that Richard quickly improvised, like when they adopted a golden retriever that Sophie named Honey, who became her constant companion. The trial of Robert Andrews and his associates took place almost a year after the arrests. Valerie testified as she had promised, her cooperation resulting in a more lenient but still significant sentence. Andrea Silverman and Roger Campbell were also convicted, their careers and reputations destroyed by the choices they had made. Paul Harrison received the lightest sentence for being the least involved in the scheme, but he still lost everything he had built. Robert Andrews was sentenced to a long prison term on multiple charges, including fraud, money laundering, and other activities. During the trial, it became clear through the testimony of various experts that he had orchestrated a complex scheme that spanned years, harming multiple companies and embezzling millions. The question of what had really happened to Thomas and Jessica remained not fully resolved. There was no concrete evidence linking Robert directly to their deaths, only suspicious circumstances and testimony that he had made threats. But Richard and Sophie's family found some peace in knowing that, even if full justice could not be achieved in this respect, the man responsible for so much suffering was now facing consequences for his actions. On a Sunday afternoon, nearly 2 years after that fateful day in the cemetery, Richard and Sophie visited Thomas's grave together. Sophie, now 10, was visibly more mature, more confident, happier. She placed fresh flowers on the headstone as they always did on their monthly visits. "Hi, Thomas," Sophie said softly, as if talking to an old friend. "I came to tell you the news. I won a gold medal at the school art festival. My drawing of butterflies was chosen as the best in my category, and Honey learned a new trick. He can catch a frisbee in the air now." Dad said you'd be proud of me. I think so too. Richard watched the scene with emotion, seeing how Sophie had grown, how she had found joy again despite all her losses. When she finished telling Thomas her news, she turned to Richard. "Your turn," she said with a smile, and Richard knelt beside the grave. "Hey, brother," Richard began, the words flowing naturally. "I kept my promise. I found the truth. I brought about justice, and I've looked after Sophie just as you asked. In fact, I've done more than look after her. She's become my daughter in every sense that matters. She's transformed my life in ways I never imagined possible. Montgomery Corp is thriving, stronger and more principled than ever. I've implemented all the changes you would have wanted to see. And most importantly, I'm being the kind of person you always believed I could be. I miss you every day, but I find comfort in knowing that your legacy lives on through everything we've managed to achieve." They stayed there for a few more moments in respectful silence before preparing to leave. But before they left, Sophie had one last thing to say. "You know, Thomas, I think you planned all of this. I think you knew Dad needed me just as much as I needed him. I think you brought us together on purpose. So thank you for that. Thank you for giving me a family." As they walked back to the car, Richard reflected on Sophie's words. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps Thomas had indeed planned it to the extent that one can plan the future. He had left the right clues, trusted the right people, and created a situation where Richard would inevitably discover not only the truth about the corruption scheme, but also discover Sophie and the need they had for each other. Life continued its natural course. Sophie grew up, becoming a teenager and then a young adult, always maintaining that gentle, artistic spirit that defined her. She never forgot Thomas or her mother Jessica, but she learned to honor their memories by living fully, by being the person they would have wanted her to be. Richard also continued to grow, not in terms of his business empire, but in terms of character and humanity. The experience of becoming a father to Sophie transformed him profoundly, teaching him about priorities, about what truly matters in life, about how love can heal wounds that seem incurable. Montgomery Corp became an example in the British business sector, known not only for its financial success but also for its ethical integrity. Richard established corporate transparency programs, created foundations that helped orphaned children, like Sophie had been, and became an active voice in movements against corporate corruption. But of all his achievements, the one that made him proudest was the family he had built with Sophie. In the quiet nights, when he reflected on his journey, Richard always returned to that moment in the cemetery, to that chance encounter with a crying girl that would change everything. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring them together, as if Thomas had been the instrument of a transformation they both desperately needed. Years later, when Sophie graduated from university with a degree in art and child therapy, dedicating her life to helping children who had gone through traumas similar to her own, Richard sat in the audience with tears of pride streaming down his face. Beside him was an empty seat he always reserved on important occasions, a seat for Thomas, for the brother who had started this journey, who had sacrificed so much to do what was right. In her graduation speech, Sophie dedicated her words to 3 people, to her mother Jessica, who had given her life and unconditional love, to Thomas, who had protected her and believed in her when she needed it most, and to Richard, who had turned sorrow into hope, promises into reality, and proved that family is not defined by blood alone, but by choice, by commitment, by love. That night, after the ceremony, after the celebrations, after all the guests had left, Richard and Sophie sat together on the porch of their home, looking up at the stars that shone over Manchester. "Do you ever regret it?" Sophie asked suddenly. "Taking me in, changing your whole life for me?" Richard looked at her, at the beautiful, compassionate young woman she had become, and smiled. "Not for a second. You were the best gift life ever gave me, Sophie. Did I save you? Maybe. But you saved me too. You taught me what really matters. You gave me purpose, meaning, love. Thomas knew exactly what he was doing when he trusted you to keep his secrets and bring you to me." Sophie rested her head on his shoulder. a gesture she had repeated thousands of times since that first day in the cemetery. I think the biggest truth Thomas wanted to reveal had nothing to do with corruption or companies. It was about us, about how two lonely people could save each other if they just gave each other a chance. Richard hugged his daughter, reflecting on the wisdom of her words. She was right. Yes, they had exposed a criminal scheme. Yes, they had brought about justice. Yes, they had transformed Montgomery Corp into a better company. But the real transformation, the real victory, was right there in that embrace, in the relationship that had grown from tragic circumstances into something beautiful and enduring. Thomas's grave in St. Francis of Assisi Cemetery remained a place of regular visits for them both over the years. But it was no longer a place of mourning and sadness. It had become a place of gratitude, of reflection, of connection to the past that had shaped their future. Each visit was a way of saying thank you, of confirming that the sacrifice had not been in vain, that the legacy lived on, strong and vibrant. And so, amidst the dense clouds and the damp cold of Manchester that still marked late August afternoons, the story that began with buried secrets and unfulfilled promises transformed into a narrative of redemption, of a family built through choice and not by chance, of a love that transcends tragedy to create something new and beautiful. Richard Montgomery, who once measured his worth in signed contracts and profits earned, learned that true success is measured in lives touched, promises kept, and love given and received. Sophie Oliver, who was once an orphan girl crying alone in a cemetery, discovered that families can be made, that homes can be found in the most unexpected places, that hope can always flourish even in the soil of tragedy. And Thomas Montgomery, whose physical presence was no more but whose spirit remained alive in every choice they made, in every value they upheld, in every moment of love they shared, finally found peace knowing that even in his absence, he had ensured that those he loved would never be alone. The cemetery was still there, its headstones marking the ends of individual stories. But in that place where usually only the sadness of farewell reigned, something rare and precious had also been born. A connection that defied death, a family that transcended blood, a love that proved that even in the darkest of circumstances, light can always find a way to shine. And so as the city of Manchester carried on with its pulsating life, with its busy streets and its inhabitants rushing from one place to another, there, in that silent cemetery, was a permanent testament that the most important stories are not about power or money, but about courage, integrity, and the infinite capacity of the human heart to love, to forgive, and to begin again. The journey that began with a simple visit to a grave, with an unknown girl and a stuffed rabbit, with whispered secrets and promises made, had transformed into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It had become a story of mutual transformation, where savior and saved were indistinguishable, where each had given the other exactly what they needed most. And in the end, perhaps that was always the most important truth Thomas wanted to reveal. Not the corporate secrets or the hidden frauds, but the fundamental truth that we are all connected, that we can find family in the most unlikely of places, and that love and courage can transform even the deepest tragedies into opportunities for growth, connection, and redemption.